The night Mara Holloway's father sold her to save himself, she made a promise. She wouldn't break. Not for him. Not for anyone. When she arrived at a collapsing cabin in the Colorado wilderness to marry a stranger buried in impossible debt, she understood the trap immediately. Two people the world had written off, thrown together to fail. But standing in that frozen mud, staring at a man who'd already given up, Mara decided something else entirely. She would stay, and she would fight. If you want to see how two broken people turned a rigged game into their greatest weapon, stay until the end. Hit that like button and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The wagon lurched to a stop, and Mara Holloway didn't move. She sat there in the back, wrapped in a wool coat 2 sizes too small, watching her breath cloud in the late October air. Around her, the Colorado frontier stretched endless and indifferent. Pine forests climbing into gray mountains, dirt roads rutted from early snow, sky the color of old bruises. Everything looked like it was waiting to freeze. "This is it," the driver said. He didn't look at her. Mara climbed down without answering. Her boots hit mud that squelched and held, and she stood there a moment, taking it in. The cabin wasn't much, logs chinked badly, roof sagging on one side, single window with oiled paper instead of glass. Smoke came from the chimney, at least. That was something. Behind her, the driver was already turning the wagon around. "Wait," Mara said. He paused, reins in hand. "Money's paid. Nothing else to wait for. I know." She pulled her single trunk from the wagon bed herself, dragging it through the mud. "Just wanted to make sure you knew. You tell my father I got here safe." The driver grunted. "Sure. And you tell him I said he can go straight to hell." That got a reaction, a quick, startled look before he flicked the reins and the wagon rolled away, leaving her alone in the mud with her trunk and a future she hadn't chosen. Mara stood there until the sound of the wheels faded completely. Then she turned toward the cabin. The door opened before she reached it. The man who stepped out was tall, lean in the way of someone who'd missed too many meals. Mid-30s, maybe. Dark hair going gray at the temples, beard untrimmed, eyes the color of winter rivers. He wore a shirt that had been patched badly, and trousers held up with rope instead of a belt. He looked at her the way you'd look at bad news you'd been expecting. "Mara Holloway?" His voice was rough, like he didn't use it much. "That's right. Elias Boone." He didn't offer his hand. "You're earlier than I thought." Stage made good time. They stood there, 10 feet apart, measuring each other. Mara knew what he was seeing. A woman built solid and heavy, curves that polite society pretended not to notice, face that wasn't pretty by any magazine standard, hands already red from cold. She'd stopped caring about that particular judgment years ago. What she saw was harder to read. Exhaustion, maybe. Resignation. A man who'd already lost and was just waiting to find out how bad it got. "You know why you're here?" Elias asked finally. "I know what I was told." Mara kept her voice level. "My father owed your creditor money. Creditor offered to forgive the debt if I married you. My father agreed. I wasn't asked." Something flickered across Elias's face. Shame, maybe, or anger. "I didn't know about that part. The arrangement, I mean. I was told you'd agreed." "Would it have mattered?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Probably not. I'm desperate enough." At least he was honest. Mara appreciated that more than she'd expected to. "Can I come inside?" she asked. "Or are we doing this out here?" Elias stepped aside. "Yeah, sorry. Come in." The cabin was worse than she'd thought. Single room, dirt floor in places where the boards had rotted through, table with 3 legs and a stump for the 4th. The stove worked, at least. She could feel heat coming off it, but the whole place smelled of damp and old smoke and something faintly rancid she didn't want to identify. There was a bed in the corner, blankets piled on it, and a shelf with maybe a dozen books. "I'll sleep out here," Elias said quickly. "You can have the bed. We'll figure that out later." Mara set her trunk down and unbuttoned her coat. "Right now, I want to understand what I walked into." Elias hesitated, then gestured toward the table. They sat across from each other, the stump wobbling slightly under Mara's weight. "How much do you know?" he asked. "Not enough. Father said you were a trapper, that you'd fallen on hard times, that Victor Halridge owned your debt and was willing to make a deal." She folded her hands on the table. "He made it sound like charity. I'm guessing it wasn't." "No." Elias rubbed his face, and Mara noticed his hands were scarred, frostbitten at the fingertips. Halridge is a land baron, owns most of the valley, wants the rest. I've got 40 acres here. Good timber, water access, sits right in the middle of what he's buying up. He's been trying to get me off it for 3 years. So why not sell? Because this land is all I've got. Elias's voice went hard. My father cleared it, built this cabin, trapped these mountains his whole life. When he died, he left it to me. It's not much, but it's mine. Until Halridge decided otherwise. Yeah. Elias looked down. 2 years ago, bad winter. Couldn't trap, couldn't hunt. Halridge showed up with a loan offer, enough to get through till spring, reasonable interest, all very friendly. I took it. By spring, I found out the interest wasn't so reasonable after all. Terms were buried in the contract, written in language I couldn't follow. I've been trying to pay it off ever since, but every season something happens. Prices drop, traps get stolen, creek floods and ruins a month's work. I'm running just to stay still. Mara listened without interrupting. She'd heard versions of this story before. Her father had been caught in similar traps 6 times. The details changed, but the pattern was always the same. And now? She asked. Now the debt's gone from $300 to $900. Halridge sent word last month, pay in full by December 1st, or he takes the land. Elias met her eyes. I don't have $900. I don't have 90. So when he offered to forgive the debt in exchange for this, I took it. For a wife. For a wife, Elias agreed quietly. I'm not proud of it, but I'm out of options. Mara sat back, the stump creaking under her. Outside, wind rattled the oiled paper in the window. She could feel cold air sliding through gaps in the walls, could see where snow had blown in and melted, leaving dark stains on the floor. You understand what he's doing, right? She said. Elias frowned. What do you mean? He's not forgiving anything. He's rigging you to fail. Mara gestured around the cabin. Look at this place. Look at you. You're barely surviving. Now he's added another mouth to feed, another body to keep warm, and he's betting you can't do it. Come spring, you'll be even worse off than before. He'll show up with some new demand, some new debt, and when you can't pay, he'll take the land anyway. Only this time, you won't be able to fight it because you'll have a wife who needs taking care of. Elias stared at her. That's exactly what he's doing, Mara cut in. He looked at you and saw someone weak. He looked at me and saw someone worthless. He's betting we'll tear each other apart or just give up. Either way, he wins. So what are you saying? Elias's jaw tightened. That this was pointless? That I should have just let him take it? No. Mara leaned forward. I'm saying he's counting on us to play his game, so we don't. How? I don't know yet. She met his eyes squarely. But I didn't come all this way to lose. Did you? For the first time since she'd arrived, something like life sparked in Elias's expression. Not hope, exactly. He looked too worn down for that. But something harder. Stubbornness, maybe. The kind of spite that kept you standing when everything else said to fall. No, he said slowly. I didn't. Then we start there. They sat in silence for a moment, the stove crackling between them. Why? Elias asked finally. Why what? Why fight for this? You didn't choose to be here. You don't owe me anything. You could walk away tomorrow and no one would blame you. Mara had been waiting for that question. She'd been asking it herself since the moment her father told her what he'd done. Because I'm tired of being thrown away, she said quietly. My whole life, people have looked at me and decided I wasn't worth keeping. Too big, too difficult, too expensive to feed. My mother died when I was 8. My father remarried within a year. New wife didn't want a daughter who looked like me, ate like me, took up space like me. So I got sent to relatives, then to work, then back home when I wasn't needed anymore. I've been traded and bargained and promised away so many times I've lost count. She paused, gathering her words. This time, I want to decide, she continued. Not my father, not Halridge, me. I want to stand on my own ground and tell everyone who tried to break me that they failed. She looked at Elias. Your land, your fight, I don't care. I'm making it mine now too. Because I'm done being someone else's problem to solve. Elias absorbed that slowly. Then, to her surprise, he nodded. All right, he said. Then we fight. Then we fight, Mara agreed. They shook hands across the table, grip firm and brief, and in that moment something settled between them. Not trust, not yet, but a recognition. Two people the world had written off, deciding that maybe the world was wrong. The fire cracked in the stove, and outside, the first snow of the season started to fall. The next morning, Mara woke to find Elias already gone. She'd slept in the bed. He'd insisted, then made himself a pallet near the stove, and the unfamiliar sounds of the cabin had kept her restless all night. Creek water running somewhere close, wind in the pines, mice in the walls. By the time gray light started seeping through the window, she'd given up and gotten dressed. The cabin was freezing. The stove had burned down to coals, and her breath misted as she added kindling, blowing gently until flames caught. While it warmed, she explored properly. It didn't take long. Besides the main room, there was a lean-to attached to one side, half storage, half disaster. Traps rusted and tangled, furs poorly cured and moth-eaten, tools broken or missing pieces. Everything looked like it had been dropped and forgotten. In the corner, she found a barrel of cornmeal with weevils, a sack of beans going moldy, and salt pork that smelled questionable. Great, she muttered. The door banged open and Elias came in carrying an armload of wood. He stopped when he saw her in the lean-to. You're up. I'm up. Mara held up the sack of beans. When did you last check your stores? I don't know. Month ago? Half of this is ruined. Elias dumped the wood by the stove. I've been focused on trapping. How's that going? His expression darkened. Not well. Mara set the beans down and came back into the main room. Show me what you've got. For the next hour, Elias walked her through his situation, and it got worse with every sentence. The trap lines weren't producing. Something kept triggering them without getting caught, or stealing bait, or just avoiding them entirely. The few pelts he had were low quality, wouldn't fetch good prices. His gear was falling apart, and his nearest neighbor was 8 miles away, too far to help with anything meaningful. What about hunting? Mara asked. Deer are scarce this year. Elk moved higher up. I got a turkey last week, but that's gone now. So we're living on cornmeal and bad pork. Until I can get into town and trade. Elias rubbed the back of his neck. Which I can't do until I have something worth trading. Mara walked to the window and looked out. Snow had stopped, leaving maybe 2 inches on the ground. The creek ran silver through the trees, and beyond it, mountains climbed into low clouds. It was beautiful, in a hard, unforgiving way. Here's what we're going to do, she said, turning back. Today, you check every trap line. I'm going through the stores, sorting what's salvageable from what's not. Tomorrow, we fix this cabin. If we're going to survive winter, we need walls that don't leak and floors that don't rot. After that, we figure out food. Elias stared at her. You're giving orders now? Someone has to. Mara crossed her arms. You've been running yourself into the ground trying to do everything alone. That stops today. We're partners now, whether we like it or not. So either we work together or we both lose. For a moment, she thought he'd argue. His jaw set, shoulders tense, and she braced for a fight. Then he exhaled, something loosening in his stance. All right, he said. We do it your way. Our way, Mara corrected. Our way, Elias agreed. He left an hour later, heading into the mountains with traps and rope slung over his shoulder. Mara watched him go, then rolled up her sleeves and got to work. The stores were worse than she'd thought. By noon, she'd sorted everything into 3 piles: keep, salvage, throw out. The throw out pile was biggest. She saved what cornmeal wasn't infested, trimmed mold off the beans, and decided the salt pork might be edible if she boiled it long enough. It wasn't much, but it was something. Next, she tackled the lean-to. Untangling traps, cleaning rust, organizing tools. Her hands got cut and filthy, and her back ached from bending over, but she kept going. There was something satisfying about bringing order to chaos, about making things functional again. By the time Elias returned, the lean-to looked almost usable. He stopped in the doorway, staring. You did all this. Most of it. Mara wiped her hands on her apron. How'd the lines go? Empty. Everyone. He looked exhausted, face drawn, shoulders slumped. I don't understand it. The sets are good. Bait's fresh. Something's wrong. Could someone be sabotaging them? Elias went still. What? Think about it. Halridge wants you to fail. Maybe he's making sure you do. That's... Elias stopped, then swore under his breath. That's possible. I've had gear go missing before, thought it was just thieves. Might be worth checking. They ate a sparse dinner, cornmeal mush and boiled pork that tasted as bad as it smelled, and talked through options. If someone was sabotaging the lines, they needed proof. If it was just bad luck, they needed better strategies. Either way, they couldn't keep bleeding resources. We need to think smaller, Mara said. Focus on what we can control. Cabin first. Food second. Trapping third. Trapping is how we pay the debt. Trapping isn't working. Mara kept her voice firm. So we find another way. Maybe we cut timber, sell firewood. Maybe we hire out labor. Maybe we get creative. But we don't keep doing the same thing and expecting different results. Elias stared into his bowl, jaw working. Then he nodded slowly. You're right, he said. I've been so focused on one path, I stopped seeing others. That's what desperation does. Mara stood and started clearing dishes. But you're not alone anymore. So let's be desperate together and see where it gets us. That got a faint smile, the first she'd seen from him. You're tougher than I expected, he said. Everyone underestimates me. Mara dumped the dishes in a bucket. I'm used to it. They worked into the evening, planning and arguing and slowly finding a rhythm. By the time they banked the fire and turned in, Mara felt something she hadn't felt in years. Useful. Like her presence mattered. Like she wasn't just taking up space. Outside, the temperature dropped and the stars came out cold and sharp. And somewhere in the mountains, something howled. The next 3 days blurred together in a haze of work. They started with the cabin. Elias climbed onto the roof and patched the worst of the sag with fresh-cut poles. Mara rechinked the walls, stuffing gaps with moss and clay until the wind stopped cutting through. They tore up rotted floorboards and replaced them with split logs. It was brutal, exhausting labor, and every night Mara collapsed into bed with muscles screaming. But it worked. By the 4th day, the cabin felt almost livable. Warmer, tighter, less like it was actively trying to kill them. Not bad, Elias said, standing back to admire their work. Not great either. Mara was inspecting the chimney, which still leaked smoke. But better. They'd fallen into an unspoken partnership. Elias handling the high work and heavy lifting, Mara managing logistics and details. They didn't talk much, but they didn't need to. Mara would point, Elias would nod, and things got done. On the 5th day, a rider came. Mara was outside drawing water when she heard hoofbeats. She looked up to see a man on a gray horse, well-dressed in a wool coat and leather gloves, face clean-shaven and smug. Behind him rode 2 others, hired muscle, by the look of them. The man dismounted smoothly. Mrs. Boone, I presume? Mara set the bucket down. Who's asking? Victor Halridge. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I wanted to meet the woman who agreed to marry poor Elias, so this was him. Mara studied him carefully. Mid-40s, well-fed, the kind of confidence that came from money and power. Everything about him screamed control. Well, you've met me, she said evenly. What do you want? Just checking on my investment. Halridge glanced toward the cabin. I trust you're settling in? We're managing. I'm sure you are. His smile widened. Though I'll admit I'm surprised. Most women would have taken one look at this place and turned right around. I'm not most women. No, Halridge agreed, gaze sliding over her in a way that made her skin crawl. You're certainly not. The cabin door opened and Elias stepped out, expression going hard the moment he saw their visitor. Halridge. Elias! Halridge turned, all false warmth. Good to see you. I was just introducing myself to your bride. Lovely woman. You're a lucky man. What do you want? Elias's voice was flat. Can't a man check on his neighbors? You're not our neighbor. You're our creditor. Such harsh words. Halridge's smile never wavered. I'm simply ensuring you're prepared for winter. It's going to be a hard one, they say. I'd hate to see you suffer. We'll be fine. Will you? Halridge glanced around, at the patched cabin, the thin smoke from the chimney, the empty trap rack. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're barely hanging on. Add another mouth to feed, and, well, I'm sure you'll manage somehow. Mara stepped forward before Elias could respond. We appreciate your concern, Mr. Halridge, but we don't need it. Halridge's gaze swung back to her, something sharp flickering in his expression. Interesting. You've got fire, I'll give you that. But fire doesn't fill stomachs or pay debts. Neither does standing around talking, Mara shot back. So unless you've got actual business, I think we're done here. For a moment, the air went tense. Halridge's smile thinned, and the men behind him shifted in their saddles. Then he laughed, a cold, calculated sound. You're right, of course. I won't take any more of your time. He climbed back onto his horse, gathering the reins. But do remember, Mrs. Boone, December 1st is coming fast, and I'm a man who keeps his accounts in order. He turned the horse and rode off, his men following. Mara and Elias stood there until the sound of hoofbeats faded. That, Elias said quietly, was a warning. I know. He's going to come after us. Let him. Mara picked up her bucket. We're not giving him the satisfaction of breaking. Elias looked at her, really looked, like he was seeing her for the first time. You meant what you said, didn't you? He asked. About fighting. Every word. Something shifted in his expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition. Then I'm glad you're here, he said. It was the first real thing he'd said to her since she'd arrived. Mara felt it settle somewhere deep, warming a part of her she'd thought was frozen. Me too, she said quietly. They went back to work. Up. November crept in cold and gray. The days blurred together, cutting wood, checking traps, stretching every scrap of food as far as it would go. Mara learned the rhythms of frontier life, how to cure meat, how to read weather, how to make a fire hot enough to keep them alive through nights that dropped below freezing. Elias taught her to set snares, to track deer, to move through the forest without snapping every branch. Slowly, grudgingly, they became a team. One evening, after a long day repairing fence line, they sat by the stove eating beans and cornbread. The cabin was warm, the work done, and for the first time in weeks, Mara felt something close to peace. Can I ask you something? Elias said suddenly. Mara looked up. Sure. Why didn't you fight your father when he told you about the arrangement? She'd been expecting that question eventually. I did, for about 10 minutes. Then I realized it didn't matter. Why not? Because he'd already made the deal. Halridge had already paid him. Fighting wouldn't change anything. It'd just make everyone angrier. She set down her spoon. So I made a different choice. I decided that if I was going to be sent away, I'd go on my own terms. And when I got here, I'd decide what happened next. Elias absorbed that. That's why you stayed. That's why I stayed. You could still leave. So could you. This is my land, and this is my fight now, too. Mara met his eyes. I told you, I'm done being thrown away. That means something. It means I stay until I decide otherwise. They sat in silence for a moment, firelight flickering between them. I judged you wrong, Elias said finally. When you first got here, I thought... He stopped, looking uncomfortable. You thought I'd be weak, useless. Yeah, everyone does. Mara shrugged. I'm used to it. Well, you're not. Weak, I mean. Elias's voice was quiet but firm. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met. Something tightened in Mara's chest. Not tears, she didn't cry, but something close. Thank you, she said. They finished dinner in comfortable silence, and when Mara lay down that night, she realized something had changed. The cabin didn't feel like a trap anymore. It felt like a beginning. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the promise of snow. And in the darkness, neither of them saw the shadow watching from the tree line. The shadow in the tree line turned out to be a man named Carson, one of Halridge's hired hands. Elias found his tracks the next morning, boot prints circling the cabin, stopping at the lean-to, lingering near the trap storage. By the time Mara came outside, Elias was crouched in the snow, jaw tight with anger. Someone was here last night, he said without looking up. Mara pulled her shawl tighter against the cold. How long? Hour, maybe more. Checking what we've got, how we're set up. He stood, brushing snow off his knees. This is how it starts. Halridge sends someone to watch, to wait for us to slip up. Or to make sure we do. Elias met her eyes, and something passed between them. Recognition of how deep this went, how deliberate. This wasn't just business. This was strategy. We need to be careful, he said. We need to be smarter, Mara corrected. Careful means hiding. Smart means staying 3 steps ahead. Over breakfast, thin porridge stretched with the last of the cornmeal, they made a plan. Elias would check the trap lines daily, looking for signs of sabotage. Mara would inventory everything they had, figure out what they could trade, what they could stretch. And both of them would watch for Halridge's men. We're running out of food, Mara said, scraping the bottom of the pot. This won't last another week. I know. So what do we do? Elias was quiet for a long moment, staring into his bowl like it held answers. There's a trading post in Slate Creek, 18 miles south. If I can get there with pelts, I can trade for supplies. You don't have pelts worth trading. I know that too. His voice went flat with frustration. But I don't know what else to do. The traps aren't producing. Hunting's been terrible. We're stuck. Mara thought about that, turning it over. Stuck. That's what Halridge wanted. For them to feel trapped, desperate, out of options. The more desperate they got, the more mistakes they'd make. What if we don't play his game at all? She said slowly. What do you mean? I mean, what if we stop trying to trap and hunt and do all the things he expects us to fail at? Mara leaned forward. What if we find something else, something he's not watching for? Like what? I don't know yet. She stood pacing the small cabin. But there has to be something, some skill, some resource, some angle he hasn't thought of. We just need to find it. Elias watched her pace, something like hope flickering in his expression. You really believe that? I have to, Mara said, because the alternative is giving up, and I didn't come this far to do that. They spent the rest of the morning taking stock. The cabin, the land, the tools, their own abilities. Elias could trap and hunt, though neither was working. He could also work leather, do basic carpentry, handle horses if they had any. Mara could cook, sew, manage numbers better than most men she'd met. She'd worked in a dry goods store for 2 years, knew how to negotiate, how to stretch inventory. What about timber? Mara asked, looking at the thick forest surrounding them. What about it? You said this land has good timber. Can we cut and sell it? Elias shook his head. Takes too long, and we'd need equipment we don't have. Plus, Halridge controls most of the mills. He'd just refuse to buy from us. What about selling direct? To homesteaders? People building? Maybe. Elias sounded doubtful. But it's November. Nobody's building in winter. Mara chewed her lip, thinking. There had to be something. Some crack in Halridge's strategy they could exploit. Tell me about the debt, she said suddenly. The original terms. I borrowed $300 2 years ago. Interest was supposed to be 10% annually. So you should owe $360 now, maybe $400 if you missed payments. Right. But the contract had clauses I didn't understand. Penalties for late payment, fees for processing, compound interest calculated monthly instead of yearly. By the time I figured it out, the debt had ballooned, and Halridge has the only copy of the contract? As far as I know. Mara felt something click in her mind. Not a solution, but a thread to pull. We need to see that contract, the actual language, because I'm betting there's something in there that doesn't hold up. Even if there is, who's going to challenge him? He owns half the county, including the judge. Then we find someone who doesn't owe him. Mara's voice hardened. Because if he's doing this to you, he's doing it to others. And if we can prove it's fraud, we've got leverage. Elias stared at her like she'd suggested flying to the moon. You want to take on Victor Halridge? In court? I want to survive December 1st. If that means taking him on, then yes. Mara, you don't understand what you're saying. The man has power, connections, money. And we have nothing to lose, Mara cut in, which makes us dangerous. Elias opened his mouth, then closed it. She could see him wrestling with hope and fear, wanting to believe but afraid of the cost. Let me think about it, he said finally. Think fast. We've got 3 weeks. That afternoon, the first real snow came. Not the light dustings they'd had before, but thick, heavy flakes that fell silent and relentless. By evening, 6 inches covered the ground, and the temperature dropped so fast Mara could feel it through the walls. They spent the night huddled near the stove, feeding it constantly to keep the cold at bay. Mara had sewn extra blankets from scraps of fabric she'd found, doubling them up for warmth. It helped, but not enough. The cabin creaked and settled around them, and outside wind howled through the pines. This is nothing, Elias said, watching frost creep across the window. January, February, that's when it gets bad. How bad? Bad enough you don't go outside unless you have to. Bad enough people die if they're not prepared. Mara pulled her blanket tighter. Then we better prepare. They sat in silence, listening to the storm. After a while, Elias spoke again, quieter this time. I'm sorry I brought you into this. Mara looked at him, surprised. You didn't bring me into anything. My father did that. Still, you deserve better than freezing in a broken cabin with a man you barely know. Maybe? Mara watched the fire. But maybe this is exactly where I need to be. How do you figure that? Because for the first time in my life, I'm not waiting for someone else to decide my worth. She met his eyes. I'm deciding it myself. And that's worth more than comfort. Elias absorbed that slowly, something shifting in his expression. You're different than anyone I've met. Different how? Stronger. Clearer about who you are. He hesitated. I gave up a long time ago. On myself, on this place. I was just going through motions, waiting to lose. Then you showed up and started acting like we could actually win. We can. I'm starting to believe you. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the snow kept falling. Tell me about your father, Mara said after a while. The one who built this place. Elias's face closed slightly, but he answered. Hard man. Didn't talk much. Spent most of his life in these mountains, trapping and hunting. He taught me everything I know about surviving out here. Did he teach you to fight? In his way. Elias's mouth twisted. He believed if you wanted something, you took it. If someone pushed you, you pushed back harder. He didn't have much use for laws or civilization. Sounds lonely. It was. Elias stared at the fire. My mother left when I was 10. Couldn't take the isolation. My father never went after her, never talked about her again. Just kept trapping, kept working this land like it owed him something. Did you want to stay? When you were younger? I didn't know anything else. He shrugged. By the time I was old enough to leave, he was sick. I stayed to take care of him. He died 3 winters ago, left me this place and nothing else. And you've been here alone since then. Yeah. Mara heard the weight in that single word. Years of isolation, of trying to live up to a hard man's legacy, of slowly losing ground to forces he didn't understand. You're not alone anymore, she said quietly. Elias looked at her, really looked, and something vulnerable flickered across his face. No, I guess I'm not. They stayed up late, talking in fragments about their pasts, their fears, the strange situation they'd found themselves in. It wasn't easy conversation. Both of them were too guarded for that, but it was real. And in the cold, dark cabin with snow piling up outside, real was enough. The storm lasted 3 days. By the time it cleared, the world had transformed into something white and silent and unforgiving. Snowdrifts climbed halfway up the cabin walls. The creek froze solid. Every breath hurt, and every surface burned with cold. Elias went out first, breaking trail to the lean-to, checking what damage the storm had done. Mara followed, moving carefully through snow that came up to her knees. Together they dug out the woodpile, cleared the roof, made sure the chimney hadn't gotten blocked. It took hours of brutal work, and by the time they finished, both were shaking with exhaustion and cold. Inside, Elias said, teeth chattering, before we freeze. They stumbled back into the cabin, stripping off wet layers, crowding the stove. Mara's fingers were so numb she couldn't feel them, and her feet ached with the beginnings of frostbite. Elias wasn't much better. His face was gray, lips blue, moving stiffly. We need to get warm, Mara said, trying to make her hands work well enough to add wood to the fire. I know. Elias was fumbling with his boots, fingers clumsy. She got the fire built up, heat slowly spreading, and turned to find Elias still struggling with frozen laces. Without thinking, she knelt and took over, working the knots loose with stiff fingers. I can do it, he protested. You can't. Hold still. She got his boots off, then his socks, revealing feet that were dangerously pale. She grabbed blankets, wrapped his feet, then did the same for her own. They sat there side by side, shaking and miserable, waiting for feeling to return. That was stupid, Elias said after a while. We stayed out too long. We didn't have a choice. The roof needed clearing. Still stupid. Mara couldn't argue with that. The cold out here wasn't like anything she'd experienced before. It was alive, aggressive, looking for any weakness to exploit. They'd gotten lucky this time. Next time, they might not. Feeling came back slowly, painfully. Mara's fingers burned and throbbed. Her feet felt like they'd been beaten. Beside her, Elias was gritting his teeth, clearly going through the same thing. "This is going to be a long winter," she said. "Yeah." They sat in silence, absorbing that reality. Outside, the world stayed frozen and hostile. Inside, the fire burned and they lived, and that was all they could ask for. Over the next week, they settled into a new rhythm. The snow had made everything harder. Travel was nearly impossible. Hunting was a joke. Even getting water from the creek required breaking ice and hauling it uphill. But they adapted. They learned to move efficiently, to conserve energy, to make every trip outside count. Mara took over cooking entirely, stretching their dwindling supplies with a creativity born of desperation. She made soup from bones they'd already boiled twice. She ground dried berries into flour, mixed it with snow for something almost like bread. She portioned everything down to the ounce, making sure nothing was wasted. Elias focused on keeping them alive. Firewood, water, maintaining the cabin, checking what trap lines he could still reach. He was gone most days from dawn to dusk, coming back frost-covered and exhausted. But he never complained, never slowed down. They were surviving, barely. One evening, about 10 days after the storm, Mara was doing inventory when she realized how bad things had gotten. 2 pounds of cornmeal left, maybe a pound of beans. The salt pork was gone. They had no sugar, no coffee, no luxuries at all. At current consumption, they had maybe a week of food remaining. "Elias," she said quietly. He looked up from where he was oiling a trap. "What?" "We're out of time. We need to make a move." "What kind of move?" Mara set down her pencil. "You said there's a trading post in Slate Creek, 18 miles. "Yeah, but I don't have anything to trade." "We'll find something." She started pulling items from the shelves, a decent knife, an old rifle that still worked, tools they could spare. "We take what we can carry. We go to Slate Creek. We trade for food. It's our only option. Mara, it's 18 miles through snow, in this cold, with no guarantee they'll even trade with us. So we don't go and we starve here. Those are the choices." Elias stared at the items she'd laid out, jaw working. She could see him calculating risks, weighing options, trying to find a better way. There wasn't one. "All right," he said finally. "We leave at first light." They spent the evening preparing, packing supplies, checking gear, planning the route. It would take 2 days minimum, maybe 3 if weather turned. They'd have to carry everything, sleep rough, hope they didn't run into trouble. "This is risky," Elias said as they worked. "Everything's risky right now." "If we get caught in another storm, we won't," Mara cut in. "We'll watch the sky, we'll move fast, and we'll make it work. Because we don't have a choice." She saw him absorb that, saw the moment he stopped arguing with reality and accepted it. "You're right," he said. "We don't." They turned in early, trying to rest before the journey. Mara lay awake listening to Elias's breathing, to the wind outside, to her own fears whispering in the dark. This was dangerous, possibly stupid, but staying put meant dying slowly, and she'd rather risk dying on her feet. She must have slept eventually, because she woke to Elias shaking her shoulder. "Time to go," he said. They left before dawn, moving through a world still dark and frozen. Elias led, breaking trail, while Mara followed in his footsteps. They each carried a pack, food, blankets, items to trade, and the weight made every step harder. The first few hours were the worst. The cold cut through every layer, finding skin, settling into bone. Mara's lungs burned with each breath. Her legs screamed in protest, but she kept moving, one foot in front of the other, refusing to stop. Around mid-morning, they reached a ridge overlooking the valley. Elias paused, breathing hard, and Mara came up beside him. Below, the world stretched white and endless. Smoke rose from scattered cabins. In the distance, she could see what must be Slate Creek, a cluster of buildings, a main road, signs of civilization. 10 miles left, Elias said. Maybe 12. We can make it by dark, if we're lucky. They started down the ridge, and the terrain got harder. Steep slopes, hidden ice, places where the snow had drifted waist deep. Twice Mara fell, both times catching herself before she slid too far. Elias pulled her up without comment, and they kept going. By afternoon, Mara's body was failing. Her legs shook with every step. Her pack felt like it weighed 100 pounds. She was so cold she couldn't feel her face, and her chest ached with the effort of breathing. Mara. Elias's voice cut through her focus. We need to rest. We're close. You're about to collapse. We rest. She wanted to argue, but her body made the decision for her. She sank down into the snow, gasping, while Elias dug through his pack for water. They shared it in silence, passing the canteen back and forth. I didn't think you'd make it this far, Elias admitted. Why not? Because this is brutal, and you're not used to it. Mara took another drink, then handed the canteen back. I'm tougher than I look. I'm learning that. They rested for maybe 10 minutes, any longer and they'd freeze, then pushed on. The sun was setting by the time they finally reached Slate Creek, both of them stumbling with exhaustion. The trading post was a low building at the edge of town, smoke rising from its chimney. Elias pushed through the door and they nearly fell inside, greeted by blessed warmth and the smell of coffee and tobacco. A man behind the counter looked up, eyebrows rising. Elias Boone! What the hell are you doing out in this weather? Need to trade, Marcus. Elias's voice was rough with fatigue. Whatever you'll take. Marcus came around the counter, frowning. You look half dead. Both of you. Sit down before you fall down. They collapsed onto benches near the stove while Marcus poured coffee. Mara wrapped her hands around the tin cup, feeling coming back in painful waves. This your wife? Marcus asked, studying Mara with open curiosity. Yeah, Mara, this is Marcus Webb, runs the post. Ma'am? Marcus nodded. Hell of a trip you made. Didn't have much choice, Mara said. Elias, what's going on? Last I heard you were barely hanging on out there. Still am. Elias pulled items from his pack, the knife, the rifle, tools. Need to trade for food. Whatever you can spare. Marcus examined each item carefully, his expression growing more concerned. This is quality gear, Elias. You sure you want to part with it? I'm sure. Because this tells me things are worse than I thought. They are, Mara cut in, and we need help. Marcus looked between them, then sighed. All right, I'll give you fair value. But you're staying the night. I've got a back room you can use. You go back out in this cold without rest, you won't make it home. Relief flooded through Mara so fast she almost cried. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. We need to talk about Victor Halridge. Elias went still. What about him? Word around town is he's squeezing you pretty hard, also that he's done the same to half a dozen other families in the valley. You know anyone else caught in his debts? Mara asked quickly. 3 for sure. Maybe more who aren't talking. Marcus leaned against the counter. Why? Mara and Elias exchanged glances. Then Elias said, Because we think he's running a scheme, and we're trying to prove it. Marcus whistled low. That's dangerous talk. We know. And you're serious about this? Taking him on? We don't have another option, Mara said. Either we fight, or we lose everything, so we're fighting. Marcus studied them both for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, then you should talk to Ben Carver. He's got a place north of here, owes Halridge money, just like you. Lost his wife last winter, couldn't afford medicine. He's got nothing left to lose, which might make him willing to help. Where can we find him? Elias asked. Not tonight. Tonight you rest. Tomorrow, I'll draw you a map. Marcus started gathering supplies, flour, beans, salt pork, coffee. In the meantime, let's get you fed and sorted. You look like hell. They spent that night in the back room of the trading post, warm and full for the first time in weeks. Mara slept deeply, dreamlessly, her body finally able to let go. When she woke, Elias was already up, talking quietly with Marcus. She joined them to find a map spread on the counter. Carver's place is here, Marcus was saying, pointing. About 6 miles northeast. If you leave now, you can make it by afternoon. And you think he'll talk to us? Elias asked. I think he'll listen. What you do with that is up to you. They gathered their new supplies, preparing to leave, when Marcus stopped them. One more thing, he said. Be careful. Halridge has people watching. If he finds out you're organizing against him, he'll come after you hard. Let him, Mara said. We're done running scared. Marcus smiled faintly. You're either very brave or very stupid. Little of both, Elias admitted. They left Slate Creek as the sun climbed higher, moving northeast through snow that had started to crust and harden. The journey to Carver's place was shorter, but no easier. Steep hills, thick forest, places where they had to break trail through drifts. But they made it. By mid-afternoon, they were standing in front of a cabin even more run down than their own, smoke trickling from a crooked chimney. Elias knocked, and after a long moment, the door opened. The man who answered was maybe 50, gaunt and hollow-eyed, with the look of someone who'd given up caring. He stared at them without speaking. "Ben Carver?" Elias asked. "Who wants to know?" "Elias Boone, this is my wife Mara. Marcus Webb sent us." Carver's expression didn't change. "What for?" "Because we think Victor Halridge cheated you the same way he cheated us," Mara said bluntly. "And we want to do something about it." For the first time, something flickered in Carver's dead eyes. "Come inside." They followed him into a cabin that made theirs look luxurious. Barely any furniture, walls that leaked cold, a man living without hope. "Tell me," Carver said, sitting down heavily. "So they did. They laid out everything, the rigged debt, the impossible terms, the pattern of families getting trapped. They explained what they suspected, what they were trying to prove." Carver listened without interrupting. When they finished, he was quiet for a long time. "He killed my wife," he said finally, voice flat. "She got sick last January. I had money for medicine, but Halridge came calling about a missed payment. Said if I didn't pay, he'd take the cabin. So I gave him the money instead of buying medicine. Sarah died 2 weeks later." Mara felt something cold settle in her chest. "I'm sorry." "I wanted to kill him," Carver continued. "Thought about it every day. But what's the point? He'd just replace himself with someone worse, and I'd hang." "There's another way," Elias said quietly. "Help us build a case. Get other families to come forward. We take him down legally. The judge is in his pocket. Then we go over his head. Federal prosecutor, territorial court, someone with authority he doesn't control." Carver looked at them like they were children. "You don't know what you're up against." "Maybe not," Mara admitted. "But we're fighting anyway, and we could use help." "Why should I? What's in it for me?" "Justice," Mara said simply. "And the chance to make sure he can't do this to anyone else." Carver stared at her, something slowly kindling behind his eyes. Not hope, he was too far gone for that. But anger, the kind that had been burning cold for months. "All right," he said. "I'll help. But you better be serious about this." "We are," Elias promised. They spent the next hour comparing notes, documenting dates and amounts, building a timeline of how Halridge operated. Carver knew 2 other families in similar situations. Together, they started to see the full scope of it, a systematic operation designed to strip people of their land and dignity. "We need the contracts," Mara said, thinking out loud. "The actual documents. Without proof of the terms, it's just our word against his. He keeps everything at his estate," Carver said. "Big house on the North Ridge. Guards, dogs, locked office." "So we break in," Mara said. Both men stared at her. "You can't be serious," Elias said. "Why not? We need proof. That's where it is. That's also where we get caught and shot." "Not if we're smart about it." Mara's mind was already racing ahead. "We watch the place, learn the patterns, find a way in when he's gone. It's risky, but so is everything else." "This is more than risky," Elias argued. "This is suicide." "Then we come up with a better plan. But we need those contracts." Carver was watching them, a faint smile on his weathered face. "You two are either crazy or the bravest damn fools I've met. Either way, count me in." Elias looked between them, clearly torn between caution and necessity. Finally, he exhaled hard. "All right," he said. "We do this carefully. We plan every step. And we don't move until we're sure." "Agreed," Mara said. They talked until dark, sketching out a plan that felt impossible, but just barely achievable. Then they said goodbye to Carver and started the long walk home, moving through a night gone brittle with cold. "That was the stupidest thing I've ever agreed to," Elias said as they walked. "Probably. We're going to get killed." "Maybe." "And you're still going to do it." "Yes." Mara looked at him in the moonlight. "Are you?" Elias was quiet for several steps. Then, Yeah, I am. Why? Because you're right about all of it. We can't just survive. We have to fight. And if that means breaking into Halridge's house and stealing evidence, then that's what we do. Something warm bloomed in Mara's chest, cutting through the cold. We're going to win this. I'm starting to believe that. They walked on through the frozen night, two people the world had thrown away, refusing to stay down. They spent the next 5 days watching Halridge's estate from the cover of pine trees half a mile distant. Elias had brought his father's old spyglass, scratched and half useless, but it was enough to track movement. They learned the rhythms, when guards changed shifts, when the dogs were let out, when Halridge himself came and went in his black carriage. He leaves every Tuesday and Thursday, Mara said, crouched beside Elias in the snow. Gone for at least 6 hours. That's when the house staff does their work, cleaning, cooking, laundry. Elias lowered the spyglass. There's always someone inside. Not in the office, look, Mara pointed. That window on the second floor, east side. Nobody's gone near it all week. Elias studied it through the glass. How do you know that's his office? Because it's the only room with bars on the windows and a separate lock on the door. I saw one of the maids get turned away yesterday when she tried to clean it. So he keeps it locked even from his own staff. Which means that's where the important papers are. Elias lowered the spyglass again, turning to look at her. His face was gaunt from days in the cold, beard iced over, eyes red-rimmed. This is insane. You know that, right? I know. We could get shot, or arrested, or both. I know that too. And you still want to do this? Mara met his gaze steadily. I don't want to. I have to. There's a difference. They'd had versions of this conversation every night for the past week, huddled around a small fire in a shelter they'd built from pine branches. Each time, Elias tried to talk her out of it. Each time, she refused to budge. And each time, he ended up agreeing anyway. Thursday, he said finally. That gives us 2 days to finalize the plan. We go in at dusk. Guards are changing shifts. Visibility's low. Everyone's focused on getting inside where it's warm. We'll need a way past the dogs. Carver said he can handle that. He used to work for Halridge, knows the animals. Elias was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right, we do this Thursday. But if anything goes wrong, if we get separated, if there's trouble, you run. Don't wait for me. Don't look back. Just run. Same goes for you. Marish, no. Her voice went hard. We're partners in this. Equal risk, equal reward. I'm not running while you play hero. Something flickered in his expression. Frustration, maybe, or respect. Possibly both. You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met. Good. You'll need that on Thursday. They made their way back to the cabin as darkness fell, moving carefully through trees that creaked and groaned with ice. The temperature had dropped again, brutal even by frontier standards, and Mara could feel the cold working its way through every layer she wore. Inside, they ate a sparse meal and went over the plan again. And again. And again. Every detail, every contingency, every way it could go wrong. By the time they finished, Mara's head was pounding and her nerves were strung tight. Get some rest, Elias said, banking the fire. Thursday's going to be a long day. What about you? I'll sleep, eventually. Mara lay down, but didn't close her eyes. She could hear Elias moving around the cabin, checking gear, sharpening his knife, doing all the small tasks that kept his hands busy and his mind from dwelling on what they were about to do. Elias? She said into the darkness. Yeah? If this goes bad, if something happens, I want you to know I don't regret coming here. There was a long silence, then, why not? I've given you nothing but hardship. You gave me a choice. That's more than anyone else ever did. She heard him exhale, a sound caught between a laugh and something sadder. You could have chosen differently. I could have, but I didn't. Mara rolled onto her side, looking toward where he sat by the dying fire. And I'd make the same choice again. Even knowing how it might end? Especially knowing that. Elias was quiet for a long time. Then he said, voice rough, I'm glad you're here. Even with everything else, I'm glad. Mara felt something tight loosen in her chest. Me too. They didn't speak again that night, but something had shifted between them. An understanding that whatever happened Thursday, they'd chosen it together. The next 2 days crawled past with agonizing slowness. They prepared everything they could think of: dark clothes, rope, tools for breaking locks, a sack for carrying documents. Carver came by Wednesday evening with a package wrapped in oiled cloth. Raw meat, he said, handing it to Elias. Soaked in valerian root. Dogs eat this, they'll sleep for hours. You're sure about this? Elias asked. I raised those dogs from puppies. I know what works. Carver looked between them. You two ready? As we'll ever be, Mara said. Then I'll see you tomorrow at the north fence line. Dusk. He left as quickly as he'd come, disappearing into the twilight like a ghost. Mara watched him go, then turned to find Elias staring at the package of drugged meat. Last chance to back out, he said quietly. I'm not backing out. Mara, stop. She put a hand on his arm. I'm scared too. But we're doing this. He looked at her, really looked, and she saw her own fear reflected in his eyes. But she also saw determination and trust. All right, he said, then let's make it count. Thursday arrived cold and clear, the kind of day where every sound carried and the air hurt to breathe. They spent the morning trying to act normal, checking traps, hauling water, doing chores, but Mara could feel tension coiling tighter with every hour. By afternoon, she couldn't eat. Her stomach was knotted, hands shaking slightly every time she tried to do something. Here, Elias handed her a cup of coffee, the last of what they'd traded for in Slate Creek. Drink this. I'm fine. You're shaking. Drink it. She took the cup, wrapping both hands around it for warmth. The coffee was bitter and strong, and it steadied her slightly. What if we can't find the contracts? She asked quietly. Then we tried. What if we get caught? Then we run like hell. What if... Mara. Elias crouched in front of her, meeting her eyes. We can't control what happens. All we can do is stick to the plan and trust each other. Can you do that? She took a shaky breath. Yes. Then that's enough. They left the cabin 2 hours before dusk, giving themselves time to reach the estate and get into position. The walk felt both endless and far too short. Every step brought them closer to the point of no return, and Mara's mind kept supplying 100 ways this could fail. Carver was waiting at the north fence line, hidden in a stand of birch trees. He nodded when they appeared, saying nothing. Together, the three of them moved closer to the estate, staying low and quiet. As the sun started to drop, they reached their final position, a rocky outcrop maybe 200 yards from the main house. From here, they could see everything. The guards making their rounds, the dogs patrolling the yard, smoke rising from multiple chimneys. There, Elias whispered, pointing. Halridge's black carriage was pulling away from the front entrance, heading down the long drive toward town. Right on schedule. Give it 20 minutes, Carver said. Let everyone settle into their evening routines. Those 20 minutes felt like hours. Mara watched the light fade, watched the guards change positions, watched her own breath cloud in front of her face. Beside her, Elias was utterly still, every muscle coiled and ready. Finally, Carver moved. Now! They slipped down from the outcrop and across open ground, moving fast and low. Carver went first, heading for the dog kennels on the west side of the house. Mara and Elias circled around to the east, looking for the window they'd identified. A guard walked past 30 feet away, and they both froze, pressed against the wall. Mara held her breath, pulse hammering in her ears. The guard paused, looking around, and for a terrible moment she thought he'd seen them. Then he kept walking. Elias touched her arm. Move. They slid along the wall until they reached the window. It was barred, just as they'd seen, but the bars were old and the mortar was crumbling. Elias pulled a pry bar from his coat and started working at the base of one bar, quiet and methodical. Somewhere in the distance, a dog started barking, then another, then silence. Carver had done his job. The bar came loose with a grinding sound that seemed impossibly loud. Elias froze, listening. No shouts, no running feet. He went back to work, loosening a second bar, then a third, creating a gap just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. You first, he whispered. No, you're bigger. If you can fit, I can. Go. Elias didn't argue. He pulled himself up and through the gap, grunting with effort. Mara heard him land on the other side. Then his hand appeared, reaching back for her. She grabbed it and pulled herself up. The bars scraped her sides, her hips barely fitting through, but she made it. Elias caught her as she tumbled into the room, both of them going down in a tangle. For a moment they just lay there, breathing hard. Then Elias stood and helped her up. They were in an office, just as they'd hoped. Dark wood paneling, a massive desk, shelves lined with ledgers and files. A locked cabinet stood against one wall, and Mara moved toward it immediately. This, she breathed. Elias was already working on the lock with a piece of bent wire, hands steady despite the circumstances. It took him maybe 2 minutes, 2 of the longest minutes of Mara's life, before the lock clicked open. Inside were stacks of contracts, letters, legal documents. Mara started pulling them out, scanning quickly in the dim light from the window. Here, she said, finding one with Elias's name. And here, Carver. And this one, I don't know this name. Take them all, Elias said. Anything that looks like a contract or agreement. They worked fast, stuffing documents into the sack they'd brought. Mara's hands were shaking again, but this time from adrenaline rather than fear. They were doing it. They were actually doing it. Then they heard footsteps in the hallway. Elias's head snapped up. Move. They scrambled for the window, Mara going first this time. She dove through the gap between the bars, scraping her shoulders raw, and hit the ground hard outside. Elias came through behind her just as the office door opened. Hey, stop! They ran. Mara had never run so fast in her life. Her lungs burned, her legs screamed, but she didn't slow down. Behind them, she could hear shouting, more voices joining in. Someone fired a gun, the shot echoing across the grounds. The creek! Elias yelled. Head for the creek! They crashed through underbrush, branches whipping at their faces. The creek was a black line ahead, running fast and cold. Without hesitating, Elias jumped in and Mara followed, the shock of ice water stealing her breath. The current grabbed them immediately, pulling them downstream. Mara struggled to keep her head up, to keep hold of the sack, to keep moving. Beside her, Elias was fighting the same battle, both of them being swept along by water that wanted to drag them under. More gunshots, closer this time. Under, Elias gasped. They ducked beneath the surface just as another shot cracked overhead. The water was so cold it felt like knives, and Mara's body started seizing up almost immediately. She kicked hard, trying to swim, trying to breathe, trying to survive. When they finally surfaced, the estate was 100 yards behind them and the shooting had stopped. But the creek kept pulling them along, relentless and freezing, and Mara knew they couldn't stay in much longer. There, Elias pointed to a fallen tree spanning the bank. Grab it. They both lunged for the tree, catching branches, hauling themselves out of the current. Mara's arms had almost no strength left, but pure desperation got her onto the bank, coughing and shaking. Elias collapsed beside her, water streaming from his clothes. We have to move. They'll track us. I can't. Mara's teeth were chattering so hard she could barely speak. You can. Come on. He pulled her to her feet, and they stumbled into the forest, leaving wet footprints in the snow. They walked for what felt like hours, putting distance between themselves and the estate. Mara's whole body was shutting down from the cold. Her clothes were freezing solid. Her fingers wouldn't work. She kept stumbling, catching herself, stumbling again. Almost there, Elias kept saying. Just a little further. She didn't know where there was until she saw the rocky overhang they'd used as a shelter earlier in the week. Elias pulled her underneath, then immediately started stripping off her frozen coat. We need fire, he said, hands shaking as badly as hers. Now. He gathered what dry wood he could find under the overhang, built a tiny fire with hands that barely functioned. It took forever to catch, but when it finally did, Mara almost cried with relief. They huddled close to the flames, both shaking violently. Mara's shoulder was throbbing. She must have heard it in the fall or the swim. She couldn't remember. Her whole body was a mass of pain and cold. Did we get them? Elias asked through chattering teeth. The contracts? Mara looked at the sack, somehow still clutched in her frozen hands. She opened it with numb fingers, checking the contents. The documents were soaked but readable. We got them, she said. Elias exhaled hard, something between a laugh and a sob. We actually did it. We actually did it, Mara repeated. and then she started laughing too, half hysterical with relief and shock. They sat there by the tiny fire, soaked and frozen and in pain, laughing like idiots, because they'd walked into Victor Halridge's estate, stolen the evidence they needed, and escaped with their lives. Against all odds, against all reason, they'd won this round. But the laughter faded fast as reality set in. They were miles from home, barely alive, and Halridge now knew exactly who had broken into his house. "He's going to come after us," Mara said quietly. "I know. Hard. I know that too." Elias fed another stick to the fire. "But we knew that going in." "What do we do now?" "We wait till first light. Then we head for Slate Creek, find Marcus, and get these documents somewhere safe. After that..." He paused. "After that, we figure out how to use them." Mara nodded, too exhausted to argue or plan. Her shoulder was definitely injured. She could feel something wrong in the joint, movement sending sharp pains through her arm. But she didn't mention it. They had bigger problems. They took turns keeping watch through the night, feeding the fire, trying to stay warm enough to survive. Every sound made Mara's heart race. Was that a horse? Were those voices? But nothing materialized out of the darkness except wind and snow. When gray light finally started seeping across the sky, they put out the fire and started moving. Mara's shoulder had stiffened overnight, and every step sent pain shooting down her arm. She gritted her teeth and kept walking. "You're hurt," Elias said, noticing her wince. "I'm fine." "Mara..." "I said I'm fine. We keep moving." They made it to Slate Creek by mid-morning, both of them looking like death. Marcus took one look at them and immediately brought them inside, firing questions. "What happened? Where have you been? There's talk all over town that Halridge's estate was broken into." "It was us," Elias said, sitting down heavily. "We got the contracts." Marcus went very still. "You did what?" Mara pulled the sack from under her coat and set it on the counter. "We have proof. Contracts showing the real terms, letters discussing strategy, documents that prove he's been running this scheme for years." "You broke into Victor Halridge's house." Marcus looked between them, expression caught between horror and disbelief. "Are you out of your minds?" "Probably," Mara admitted. "But we did it. And now we need help." "Help doing what?" "Getting these to someone who can use them. Someone with authority Halridge doesn't control." Marcus rubbed his face, clearly trying to process what he was hearing. "There's a federal prosecutor who comes through Denver every few months, Harrison Wade. He's got a reputation for going after corruption." "Can you get word to him?" Elias asked. "I can try. But it'll take time, and Halridge isn't going to wait. He'll know it was you. He'll come after you hard." "Let him come," Mara said, voice harder than she felt. "We're not running." "You should. You should take these documents and disappear until Wade can act." "And abandon everything?" Elias shook his head. "No, we've come too far to run now." Marcus looked at them both, exhausted, injured, half frozen, but absolutely refusing to back down, and something shifted in his expression. "All right," he said finally. "I'll get word to Wade, tell him it's urgent. In the meantime, you two need to hole up somewhere safe. My place is too obvious, but I know a family about 10 miles west who might take you in." "We need to go back to the cabin," Mara said. "That's suicide." "That's our home." She met Marcus's eyes. "And we're not giving it up." Marcus started to argue, then stopped. He'd clearly learned that arguing with Mara was pointless. "Then at least let me send someone to watch your back," he said. "Carver, maybe. He's got as much stake in this as you do." "Where's Carver?" Elias asked suddenly. "Did he make it out?" "He came through here yesterday evening, said you'd split up after the estate. He's lying low at his place." Relief flooded through Mara. She'd been trying not to think about what might have happened to him. They spent the rest of the day at the trading post, drying their clothes, tending wounds, eating the first real food they'd had in days. Marcus examined Mara's shoulder and pronounced it badly sprained but not broken. He wrapped it tight, gave her willow bark for the pain, and told her to rest it. "Like that's going to happen," Elias muttered. "I heal fast," Mara said. "You're also stubborn enough to ignore when your body's falling apart." That too. They left Slate Creek at dusk, moving carefully through forest that felt suddenly full of eyes and threats. Every shadow could be one of Halridge's men. Every sound could be pursuit. But they made it home without incident, finding the cabin cold and dark but untouched. Elias built up the fire while Mara checked their supplies. Someone had been here. Boot prints in the snow, things slightly out of place, but nothing was taken or destroyed. "Warning," Elias said when she mentioned it, letting us know they can reach us any time. Then we stay ready. They fortified the cabin as best they could, barred the door, covered the window, kept weapons close. Then they waited. The attack came 3 days later. Mara woke to the sound of breaking glass. She rolled out of bed, grabbing the rifle they kept loaded just as the door shuddered under a heavy impact. "Elias!" she shouted. He was already up, knife in hand, moving to brace the door. Another impact, harder this time, and the bar cracked. "Back window!" Elias yelled. Mara ran for it, rifle raised, and saw 3 men outside trying to pry the boards loose. She fired once, high, and they scattered. Behind her, the front door gave way. 2 men rushed in, and Elias met them head-on. He caught the first with a knife thrust that sent the man screaming backward. The second grabbed him, and they went down fighting. Mara spun, trying to get a clear shot, but they were moving too fast. She reversed the rifle and swung it like a club, catching the second man across the head. He dropped, and Elias scrambled up, breathing hard. "More coming," he gasped. They could hear voices outside, men organizing for another rush. Mara's mind raced. They couldn't hold the cabin against a sustained attack. They needed to move. "Out the back," she said. "Into the forest. They'll track us. Then we make them work for it." They grabbed what they could carry, weapons, the sack of documents, basic supplies, and ran for the back window. Elias went through first, then helped Mara down. Her shoulder screamed in protest, but adrenaline kept her moving. They hit the tree line just as the men broke through the front door again. Shouts behind them, then gunfire, bullets whipping through branches. Mara ran harder than she'd ever run, feet slipping on ice and snow, lungs burning. Beside her, Elias was doing the same, both of them desperate and terrified and absolutely refusing to stop. They ran until the sounds of pursuit faded, until their legs gave out, until they collapsed in the snow with nothing left to give. "We can't go back," Elias said between gasps. "Not now." "I know." "We've lost the cabin." "I know." He looked at her, and she saw the weight of it hit him. Everything he'd fought for, gone. The land his father had cleared, the home he'd tried so hard to save, all of it lost because they'd chosen to fight. "I'm sorry," Mara said quietly. "Don't be." Elias's jaw set hard. "We made the right choice. We hurt him, and he's scared. That's why he came after us this hard. Doesn't make it easier." "No, but it makes it worth it." They sat there in the snow as darkness fell around them. 2 people who'd lost everything and gained something they couldn't name. An alliance, a purpose, maybe even the beginning of something deeper. "We need to get to Denver," Mara said finally. "Find Wade, give him the evidence, make sure this counts." "That's a long way. And we've got no money, no supplies, nothing but what we're carrying." "Then we figure it out." Mara struggled to her feet, ignoring the pain in her shoulder. "One step at a time, same as always." Elias looked up at her, and something fierce sparked in his expression. "You don't quit, do you?" "Not until I'm dead, and maybe not even then." He laughed, actual laughter, rough and real, and stood beside her. "Then I guess we're going to Denver." They started walking through the frozen night, leaving behind the only home either of them had known, carrying nothing but stolen documents and the absolute certainty that they'd chosen the harder path for the right reasons. Behind them, the cabin burned. They walked through the night until Mara's legs gave out completely. She didn't fall. Elias caught her before she hit the ground, but her body had reached its limit and simply stopped cooperating. "We need to rest," Elias said, lowering her gently against a tree trunk. "Can't stop. They're following." "They're not. I've been checking. We lost them hours ago." He crouched beside her, studying her face in the moonlight. "You're done, Mara. We stop or you collapse. Those are the options." She wanted to argue, but her vision was going gray at the edges, and her shoulder felt like someone had driven hot nails through it. Just for a few minutes. A few hours. Elias was already gathering pine branches, building a crude shelter against the base of a massive spruce. "Get under here. I'll keep watch." Mara crawled into the shelter and was asleep before she could protest further. She woke to pale daylight and the smell of smoke. For a terrible moment, she thought the cabin was burning again, then remembered. They'd left the cabin. They were in the forest. They were running. Easy, Elias's voice close by. It's just a small fire. We're safe. Mara sat up slowly, her whole body one massive ache. Her shoulder had stiffened overnight into something barely functional. How long was I out? Maybe 4 hours? Sun's been up about an hour. You should have woken me. We need to move. We need food more. Elias handed her something wrapped in leaves. Ate it. It's not much, but it's something. Inside was a piece of roasted rabbit, barely enough for 2 bites. Mara's stomach clenched with hunger at the smell. Where did you get this? Set a snare last night while you slept. Got lucky. They split the meat in silence, chewing slowly to make it last. It wasn't nearly enough. Mara was still starving when she finished, but it took the edge off. Denver's maybe 80 miles southeast, Elias said, poking at the fire. If we're lucky and the weather holds, we can make it in 5 or 6 days. If we're not, he shrugged. We'll make it. With no supplies, no money, winter coming down hard, and Halridge's men probably watching every road. Elias looked at her. I admire your optimism, but we need to be realistic. Realistic is what got us into this mess. Mara struggled to her feet, biting back a groan as her shoulder protested. Realistic is what Halridge counts on, that we'll look at the odds and give up. So we don't be realistic, we be stubborn. A faint smile crossed Elias's face. Stubborn, I can do. They put out the fire and started walking. The terrain was rough, steep hills, thick undergrowth, streams frozen solid that they had to navigate around. Mara's shoulder made everything harder, but she gritted her teeth and kept pace. Around midday they reached a road. Not much of one, rutted dirt track that might see a wagon once a week, but it pointed roughly southeast. We follow this? Mara asked. Faster than cutting through forest, but more exposed. Risk versus reward. Always is. Elias studied the road both directions, then nodded. We follow it, but we stay alert. They walked the road for maybe 2 hours before they heard hoofbeats behind them. Both of them dove for the tree line immediately, hiding in the underbrush as a rider approached. But it wasn't one of Halridge's men. It was a woman on a plow horse, maybe 60 years old, bundled in layers of wool and looking half frozen. Elias stepped out carefully. Ma'am, you all right? The woman reined in, studying them with sharp eyes. Depends. You two the ones Halridge is hunting? Mara tensed, but Elias just nodded. Word travels fast. Word travels when a man burns down a cabin and sends armed men through the valley looking for fugitives. The woman's expression was hard to read. So yes, word travels. Question is, what are you doing about it? Going to Denver, Mara said, emerging from cover. We've got evidence of what he's been doing. We're taking it to the federal prosecutor. Evidence. The woman snorted. And you think that'll matter? Men like Halridge don't go down easy. Maybe not, but we're trying anyway. The woman studied them both for a long moment, then sighed. My name's Ruth Carlson. Halridge took my son's land 3 years ago, drove him off with debts he couldn't pay. Boy ended up in California. Haven't heard from him since. She gestured to the space behind her on the horse. One of you can ride? Won't get you all the way to Denver, but I can get you to the next town. There's a stage that runs through there. We don't have money for a stage, Elias said. Didn't ask if you did. Ruth's voice went firm. Someone needs to stand up to that bastard. If you're doing it, I'll help however I can. Now get on before I change my mind. Mara and Elias exchanged glances. Then Mara said, Thank you. Don't thank me yet. We've got 10 miles to cover and my horse is old. Elias climbed up behind Ruth and they started down the road at a pace faster than walking but slower than Mara would have liked. Still, it was better than stumbling through the forest. She kept pace beside the horse, ignoring her screaming muscles. Ruth talked as they traveled, filling in details about Halridge's operation they hadn't known. How he'd been working the valley for nearly a decade. How he'd bought off the local judge, the sheriff, even the newspaper editor. How families had tried to fight back before and been crushed. So what makes you think you'll succeed where others failed? Ruth asked. Because we're not fighting alone anymore, Mara said. We've got evidence, we've got witnesses, and we're taking it outside his sphere of influence. Federal prosecutors in Denver, that's still Colorado territory. Halridge has reached there too. Maybe. but not as much. Mara was breathing hard from the pace, but she kept talking. And we're betting that if we make enough noise, if we present a strong enough case, someone will listen. That's a big bet. It's the only one we've got. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My husband fought in the war, came back with a medal and nightmares. He used to say the difference between brave and stupid was whether you won. I never knew if I agreed with that." "What do you think now?" Elias asked. "I think you two are either the bravest people I've met or the dumbest, and I genuinely don't know which." She pulled the horse to a stop. "This is as far as I go. Town's another 3 miles down this road. Stage comes through on Fridays, that's tomorrow. You've got till then to figure out how you're getting on it." "We'll figure something out," Mara said. "We always do." Ruth reached into her coat and pulled out a small cloth bag. "Take this. It's not much, but it'll get you a hot meal and maybe a place to sleep." "We can't," Elias started. "You can and you will." Ruth's voice brooked no argument. "I lost my son to that man. If you can hurt him even a little, it's worth every penny." She pressed the bag into Elias's hands. "Now go, and don't waste what I'm giving you." She turned the horse around and rode back the way they'd come, leaving Mara and Elias standing in the road with a bag of coins and something that felt dangerously close to hope. The town was called Redemption, which Mara found darkly funny given their circumstances. It consisted of maybe 24 buildings clustered around a main street: general store, saloon, boarding house, blacksmith, the kind of place people pass through on their way to somewhere else. They found the boarding house and used some of Ruth's money to rent a room for the night. The proprietor, a thin man with suspicious eyes, looked them over carefully. "You two married?" he asked. "Yes," Mara said without hesitation. "Uh-huh." He clearly didn't believe her, but also didn't care enough to argue. "Room's upstairs, second door. Dinner's at 6 if you want it. Extra cost." "We'll take it," Elias said. The room was tiny. A bed, a wash basin, a single window looking onto the street, but it was warm and dry and had a lock on the door. Mara collapsed onto the bed the moment they were alone. "We need to be careful," Elias said, checking the window. "Halridge has people everywhere. If word gets back that we're here—" "I know." Mara closed her eyes. "But I needed to sit down before I fell down." She heard him move around the room, checking corners, testing the lock. Always vigilant, always preparing for the next fight. "Elias," she said without opening her eyes. "Yeah?" "When this is over, assuming we survive, what are you going to do?" He was quiet for a long time. "I don't know. The cabin's gone. The land's probably forfeit. I've got nothing to go back to." "You could start over somewhere. California, maybe. Oregon." "Could." He sat down on the edge of the bed. "What about you?" "Same problem. No home, no family, no prospects." She finally opened her eyes, looking at him. "Guess we're both starting from nothing again." "Not nothing." Elias's expression was difficult to read. "We've got each other, if you want that." Something warm bloomed in Mara's chest, cutting through the exhaustion and pain. "I want that." "Good." He looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the emotion. "Because I don't think I could do this alone anymore." "You're not alone. You haven't been since I showed up." "I know. That's what scares me." "Why?" "Because I got used to relying on myself, trusting no one. And now—" He stopped, searching for words. "Now I trust you more than I've trusted anyone in my life. And if something happens to you because I dragged you into this—" "So stop." Mara sat up, ignoring her shoulder's protest. "You didn't drag me anywhere. I chose this. Every step, every risk, every terrible decision, that was me choosing, and I'd do it again." Elias looked at her, really looked, and something shifted in his expression. Then carefully, he leaned forward and kissed her. It was brief, tentative, almost apologetic. When he pulled back, he looked as surprised as she felt. "Sorry," he said. "I shouldn't have—" Mara kissed him back, harder this time, putting into it all the fear and determination and strange affection that had built between them over the past months. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Don't apologize," she said quietly. "Not for that." They sat there for a moment, the air between them charged with something new and fragile. Then Elias cleared his throat and stood. We should get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be complicated. Everything's complicated. Yeah, but tomorrow especially. They took turns washing up and changing into the spare clothes they'd grabbed from the cabin. When darkness fell, they both climbed into the bed. No discussion, no awkwardness, just a natural progression of something that had been building since the day Mara arrived. For the first time in weeks, Mara slept soundly. Morning came cold and clear. They ate breakfast in the boarding house's small dining room, eggs and biscuits that tasted like heaven after days of near starvation, and counted what money they had left. Not enough for 2 stage tickets, Elias said quietly. Then we find another way. They walked to the stage office and found a bored clerk reading a newspaper. He looked up when they entered, taking in their worn clothes and hard-traveled appearance. Help you? How much for 2 tickets to Denver? Mara asked. $4 each. Stage leaves at noon. Mara's heart sank. They had maybe $3 left total. What about work? Is anyone hiring? Not this time of year. Everyone's hunkered down for winter. The clerk went back to his paper. Sorry. Outside, they stood in the street trying to figure out their next move. The stage was their best option. Fastest, safest, least likely to run into Halridge's people. But without money, it might as well be on the moon. We could sell something, Elias suggested. My knife, maybe. We need that. We need the stage more. Mara was about to argue when she noticed a poster on the wall of the general store. Help wanted for trail crew. Inquire within. Wait here, she said. Inside, she found the store owner and asked about the poster. He was skeptical. Trail crew was hard work, usually reserved for men. But Mara talked fast and convincingly. She'd worked harder jobs than clearing trails. She was strong, reliable, and desperate. I can give you half a day's work, he said finally. Clearing snow from the loading area out back. $2 if you finish by noon. Done. She worked like her life depended on it, which it did. Shoveling snow, hauling crates, organizing inventory. Her shoulder screamed in agony with every movement, but she ignored it. By 11:30, the job was finished, and the store owner grudgingly handed over $2. Meanwhile, Elias had sold his father's old pocket watch to the blacksmith for $1.50. Combined with what they had left, they walked into the stage office at 11:45 with exactly $8. 2 tickets to Denver, Mara said, laying the money on the counter. The clerk counted it, stamped 2 tickets, and slid them across. Stage leaves in 10 minutes. Don't be late. They climbed aboard a stage already half full of passengers, a merchant, a young couple, an older woman traveling alone. Everyone kept to themselves, which was fine by Mara. She was too exhausted for small talk. The stage lurched into motion, and redemption fell away behind them. Mara leaned against Elias's shoulder and closed her eyes, letting herself rest for the first time since they'd fled the burning cabin. The journey to Denver took 3 days of brutal travel. They stopped at way stations each night, sleeping in crowded rooms with strangers, eating whatever food was available. Mara's shoulder got worse instead of better, and by the 2nd day she was running a fever. You need a doctor, Elias said, feeling her forehead. I need to get to Denver. Morrison, I'm fine, just tired. She wasn't fine. She was burning up, the wound in her shoulder clearly infected despite the wrapping. But they were so close now, maybe a day from Denver, and she refused to stop. They reached the city on the afternoon of the 3rd day. Denver was bigger than anything Mara had seen, streets crowded with wagons and horses, buildings 3 stories tall, people everywhere. The noise and chaos was overwhelming after months in the wilderness. Where do we find Wade? Mara asked, clinging to Elias's arm as they navigated the crowded sidewalk. Federal Courthouse should be on Larimer Street. They found it an hour later, an imposing brick building with columns and a flag flying out front. Inside, they approached a clerk at a desk. We need to see Harrison Wade, Elias said. Prosecutor Wade is in trial. He won't be available until tomorrow at the earliest. This can't wait until tomorrow. The clerk looked up, irritated. Then he saw their faces. Mara's fever-bright eyes, Elias's desperate expression, and his tone softened slightly. What's this regarding? Land fraud, debt manipulation, criminal conspiracy. Mara pulled the sack of documents from under her coat and set it on the desk. We have evidence. The clerk's eyebrows rose. Evidence of what, exactly? Proof that Victor Halridge has been illegally seizing property across Colorado territory using fraudulent contracts and corrupt local officials. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious crime, Mara said, and we risked everything to bring you proof. The clerk studied them for another moment, then stood. Wait here. He disappeared through a door, leaving them standing in the lobby. Mara swayed on her feet, and Elias caught her elbow. Sit down before you fall. Can't. Have to stay. Her vision grayed out, and she felt herself sliding toward the floor. Elias caught her, lowering her onto a bench. Mara? Mara, stay with me. She tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. Everything felt distant and strange, like she was floating away from her own body. I need a doctor! Elias's voice, sharp with panic. Someone get a doctor. The world faded to black. When Mara woke, she was in a bed in a room she didn't recognize. Clean white walls, sunlight through a window, the smell of carbolic and soap. Easy. A woman's voice, calm and professional. You're in the hospital. You've been very sick. Mara tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't cooperate. Elias, the documents. Your husband is fine. The documents are safe. The woman, a nurse by her uniform, pressed Mara gently back down. You had a severe infection in your shoulder. The doctor had to drain it. You've been unconscious for 2 days. 2 days? Panic spiked through her. You need to rest. Doctor's orders. You don't understand. We have to... Mrs. Boone. A man's voice, authoritative but not unkind. Mara turned her head to see a well-dressed man in his 50s standing in the doorway. My name is Harrison Wade. I'm the federal prosecutor your husband contacted, and I need to speak with you about your allegations against Victor Halridge. Relief and fear washed through her in equal measure. The documents are currently being reviewed by my staff. Very interesting reading. Wade pulled a chair over and sat beside the bed. Your husband has given me a preliminary statement, but I need to hear your version, if you're up for it. I'm up for it. For the next hour, Mara talked. She told Wade everything, how her father had sold her into the marriage, how she'd discovered Halridge's scheme, how they'd broken into his estate to steal evidence. She left nothing out, including their own illegal actions. Wade listened without interrupting, taking notes in a small leather book. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. This is potentially the largest fraud case I've seen in Colorado territory, he said finally. If your evidence holds up, and preliminary review suggests it will, we're looking at dozens of victims, hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal seizures, and corruption reaching into multiple county governments. Can you prosecute? Mara asked. I can try, but I'll need more than documents. I'll need witnesses willing to testify, people who can corroborate what you're claiming. We know at least 4 other families caught in his debts, maybe more. Can you put me in contact with them? Yes, but they're scared. Halridge has destroyed people who stood against him before. Then we'll have to convince them that this time is different. Wade stood. Get some rest, Mrs. Boone. When you're recovered, we have a lot of work to do. He left, and Mara lay back against the pillows, exhausted but cautiously hopeful. They'd made it. Against all odds, they'd gotten the evidence to someone who could use it. Elias appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, looking worn but relieved. You're awake. I'm awake. Mara reached for his hand. Wade was here. He's taking the case. I know. He's been working on it nonstop since we arrived. Elias sat on the edge of the bed. You scared me. When you collapsed, I'm fine. You're not fine. You nearly died. But I didn't. She squeezed his hand. We made it, Elias. We actually made it. He looked at her, and she saw everything they'd been through reflected in his eyes. The fear, the pain, the impossible choices, but also something else, pride, maybe, a recognition that they'd accomplished something that mattered. Yeah, he said quietly. We did. Mara spent another week in the hospital, recovering from the infection and the accumulated damage of their journey. During that time, Wade worked tirelessly. He sent investigators to interview the families Mara had identified. He subpoenaed records from Halridge's bank. He built a case brick by brick. Ben Carver came to Denver to testify. So did Ruth Carlson. So did three other families Mara hadn't even known about, all of them pulled into Halridge's web and stripped of their property. The evidence mounted, contract after contract showing impossible interest rates hidden in legal language. Letters between Halridge and the county judge discussing how to manipulate court dates and rulings. Financial records proving he'd seized property worth 10 times what was owed. This goes to trial next month, Wade told them during one of his visits. Halridge has lawyered up, best defense attorney in Denver, but the case is solid. We're going to win this. What happens to our land? Elias asked. The cabin's gone, but the property? If we prove fraud, all seizures will be voided. You'll get your land back, along with compensation for damages. Wade's expression was serious. But you need to understand, Halridge won't go quietly. He's already filed countersuits claiming you broke into his property and stole documents. He's pushing for criminal charges. Let him, Mara said. We did break in. We did steal documents, but we had cause, and we can prove it. That defense will work in the court of public opinion. Legally, it's more complicated. Wade looked between them. I'm doing everything I can to shield you from prosecution, but you need to be prepared for the possibility that this gets messy. It's already messy, Elias said. We'll deal with whatever comes. The trial began on a cold January morning. The courthouse was packed. Journalists, curious citizens, families Halridge had wronged, and Halridge himself sitting at the defense table in an expensive suit with his attorney whispering in his ear. Mara and Elias sat in the front row of the gallery, watching as Wade laid out the prosecution's case. It was methodical, devastating, document after document, witness after witness, building an irrefutable picture of systematic fraud. Halridge's attorney tried to poke holes in the evidence, tried to paint Mara and Elias as criminals and liars. But the documents didn't lie. The math didn't lie. And when Mara took the stand on the third day, she told the truth in a clear, steady voice that left no room for doubt. Did you break into Mr. Halridge's estate? The defense attorney asked during cross-examination. Yes. And did you steal documents from his private office? Yes. So you admit to multiple felonies. I admit to doing what was necessary to stop a man who was destroying families and stealing their futures. Mara met the attorney's eyes. If that makes me a criminal, then I'll wear that label, but I won't apologize for fighting back. The gallery erupted in applause. The judge gavelled for order. And Mara saw something flicker across Halridge's face, the first crack in his confident facade. The trial lasted 2 weeks. By the end, even Halridge's expensive attorney looked beaten. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. The verdict came down on a Friday afternoon. Halridge was convicted of fraud, corruption, conspiracy, and a dozen other charges. His assets were frozen. His seized properties were ordered returned to their rightful owners. The judge who'd helped him was removed from the bench and faced his own charges. It was over. Mara stood outside the courthouse as snow started to fall, watching journalists swarm Halridge's attorney. Beside her, Elias was quiet, processing what had just happened. We won, she said softly. We won, he agreed. I can't believe we actually won. I can. Elias turned to look at her. You said we would. From the very beginning, you said we'd fight and we'd win, and you were right. Wade emerged from this courthouse, looking tired but satisfied. That was one for the history books. Halridge is looking at 10 years minimum, possibly more, and every family he wronged is getting restitution. What about the criminal charges against us? Mara asked. Dropped. Given the circumstances and the public interest, the prosecutor agreed not to pursue them. Wade smiled. You're free and clear, both of you. The relief was so intense Mara actually felt her knees weaken. Thank you for everything. Thank you for having the courage to bring this forward. You didn't have to. You could have walked away and saved yourselves a lot of pain, but you chose to fight, and that fight just saved dozens of families from the same fate you faced. He shook their hands and headed back inside. Mara and Elias stood there in the falling snow, letting reality sink in. What now? Elias asked finally. Now we go home, Mara said. We rebuild. We start over. On land that's actually ours this time. On land that's actually ours. They started walking down the courthouse steps. Two people who'd lost everything and won it back through sheer, stubborn refusal to quit. The future was uncertain. They still had to rebuild a cabin, restore the land, figure out how to survive another winter. But for the first time since Mara had arrived in Colorado, the future felt possible. "Hey," Elias said, catching her hand. "What?" "I love you." "I don't think I've said that yet, but I do." Mara felt warmth bloom in her chest, cutting through the cold. "I love you too, even though you're a terrible trapper and you make the worst coffee I've ever tasted." He laughed, real laughter, free and unburdened. "So we're doing this. Actually building a life together? We already built one. Now we're just making it official." They walked through Denver as evening fell, planning and dreaming and allowing themselves to believe that maybe, just maybe, they'd earned their chance at something better. Behind them, the courthouse stood solid and imposing, a reminder that sometimes justice actually worked. Sometimes the system could be turned against those who'd corrupted it, and sometimes two people written off as worthless could change everything. The restitution money came through in March, delivered by a federal marshal who looked bored with the whole process. $3,000, compensation for the burned cabin, the stolen years, the orchestrated destruction of their lives. Mara held the bank draft in her hands and felt nothing. No relief, no joy, just exhaustion. "It's not enough," she said quietly. Elias was counting out smaller payments destined for the other families who'd testified. "It's never enough, but it's something. $3,000 for everything we went through, everything we lost. We didn't lose everything." He looked up at her. "We're still here. We won. That counts for more than money." Mara wanted to believe that. Most days she did. But standing in the Denver boarding house room they'd been living in for 3 months, surrounded by other people's noise and other people's lives, she felt hollowed out. The trial was over. Halridge was in prison. The land was theirs again. And somehow, none of it felt like victory. "What if we can't do it?" she asked. "What if we go back and it's too much? What if we—" "Then we fail." Elias set down the money and came to her. "And we pick ourselves up and try something else. But we don't know until we go back." "I'm scared." "So am I." That helped somehow, knowing he was scared too, knowing this wasn't easy for either of them. They left Denver 2 days later on a supply wagon headed northwest. The driver was a man named Patterson, who'd heard about the trial and offered them transport for half the usual rate. He talked the whole way about how Halridge had tried to squeeze him out of business 5 years back, how he'd barely escaped the same trap that caught Elias. "You two are heroes," Patterson said, as the wagon rolled through mountain passes still heavy with late winter snow. "Taking down a man like that, people are going to remember this." Mara didn't feel like a hero. She felt tired and uncertain, and deeply aware that the hard part was just beginning. They reached the land on a gray afternoon when the sky looked like it might snow or rain, or just give up entirely. The cabin site was a blackened scar on the earth, charred timber and ash marking where their home had stood. The lean-to was gone. The well was filled with debris. Everything they'd built together had been erased. "Well," Elias said, staring at the destruction. "Could be worse." "How?" "We could be dead." Mara laughed, a short, bitter sound. Always the optimist. Someone has to be. They set up a temporary camp using canvas and salvaged poles, creating a shelter that was barely functional. That first night back on their land, Mara lay awake listening to the creek and the wind and feeling the weight of what they'd committed to. "You awake?" Elias asked from his bedroll a few feet away. "Yeah." "What are you thinking?" "That we're idiots. That we could have taken the money and gone to California or Oregon or anywhere else. That we chose to come back to 40 acres of nothing and start from scratch." "We did." "Why?" Elias was quiet for a long time. "Because running felt like losing, and I'm tired of losing. We won the trial. I mean losing in the bigger sense. Giving up. Letting fear make our decisions." He shifted in his bedroll. "This land, it's not much, but it's ours. Really ours now. No debt, no strings. And building something here, making it work, that feels like winning in a way that just walking away never would." Mara absorbed that. "What if I can't do it? What if I'm not strong enough for this?" "You broke into a land baron's house, stole evidence, survived being hunted across the territory, testified in federal court, and won. You're plenty strong enough." That was adrenaline. This is different. This is waking up every day and choosing to stay when everything's hard and there's no dramatic fight to win. Yeah, Elias's voice was soft in the darkness. That's the real fight, isn't it? The one that doesn't end. How do we win that one? One day at a time, I guess. Same as everything else. Spring came slowly, grudgingly. They worked from dawn to dusk, clearing the burn site, salvaging what they could, planning the new cabin. Elias had learned from his father's mistakes. This time, they'd build with stone foundation, proper chimney, walls that wouldn't leak. It would take longer, but last better. Ben Carver showed up the second week with a wagon full of timber and 2 days of free labor. "Heard you were rebuilding," he said by way of greeting. "Figured you could use help." "We can't pay you," Elias warned. "Didn't ask you to. You got my land back, got me restitution. This is me settling accounts." Ruth Carlson came the following week with her sons, grown men who'd heard what Mara and Elias had done and wanted to contribute. They brought food, tools, and muscle. Within 2 weeks, the foundation was laid and walls were going up. "I don't understand," Mara said to Ruth one evening as they cooked dinner for the work crew. "Why are all these people helping us?" Ruth looked at her like she'd asked why water was wet. "Because you fought. Not just for yourselves, for all of us. You showed people that fighting back was possible, that men like Halridge could be beaten." She stirred the pot of stew. "Hope's a powerful thing, girl. You gave people hope. This is them giving it back." The cabin took shape through April and into May. It was bigger than the old one, better planned. 2 rooms instead of 1. A real floor. A stone fireplace that wouldn't burn the place down. Every nail Mara drove, every board she set, felt like proof of something she couldn't quite name. Not victory. Something quieter than that. Persistence, maybe. The stubborn refusal to stay beaten. Elias was different too. The hollow-eyed desperation that had defined him when she first arrived was gone, replaced by something more solid. He smiled more, laughed occasionally, worked with purpose instead of just going through motions. One afternoon, taking a break from chinking walls, he said, "I need to tell you something." Mara set down her tools. "What?" "I gave up before you came. I'd already decided I was going to lose the land, lose everything, and I'd just accepted it." He looked at his hands, rough and scarred from work. "I was waiting to die, basically, going through the motions but already gone inside." "I know." "You do?" "I saw it the day I arrived. You looked like a dead man who hadn't laid down yet." "That's exactly what I was." Elias met her eyes. "And then you showed up and refused to accept any of it. The defeat, the hopelessness, all of it. You just looked at the situation and decided we were going to fight. And somehow, that was enough to pull me back. I didn't do anything special. You did the hardest thing there is. You chose not to quit when quitting was the logical choice. You chose to believe we could win when every scrap of evidence said otherwise." His voice roughened. "You saved my life, Mara. Not in the dramatic sense, in the real sense. You gave me a reason to keep living." Mara felt tears threaten and pushed them down. She didn't cry. She never cried. "You saved mine too, just in a different way." "How?" "You treated me like I mattered, like my ideas and my work and my presence were valuable. Nobody's ever done that before." She looked at the half-built cabin, at the land stretching around them. "My whole life, people looked at me and saw a problem. Too big, too expensive, too difficult. You looked at me and saw a partner. Because that's what you are. I know that now, but I didn't then." They stood there in the spring sunshine, 2 people who'd been thrown away finding worth in each other. It wasn't romantic in any storybook sense. It was messier than that, harder. But it was real. The cabin was finished by mid-June. They held a small gathering to celebrate. Everyone who'd helped with construction, plus Marcus from Slate Creek, and a few families from the valley who'd been freed from Halridge's debts. They roasted a pig that Ruth donated, drank whiskey that Carver brought, and told stories late into the night. "Tamara and Elias!" someone shouted, raising a glass. "Who taught us that fighting back wasn't suicide?" Everyone cheered. Mara stood there feeling uncomfortable with the attention, but also strangely moved. These were people who'd suffered, who'd lost homes and family members and hope. And somehow, her and Elias's stubborn refusal to accept defeat had sparked something in them too. Later, after everyone had left and they were alone in the new cabin for the first time, Elias said, "This is really ours." "It really is. No debt, no one coming to take it, just ours." Mara tested the idea, rolling it around in her mind. Ownership, security, a future that wasn't borrowed or conditional. Feels strange. Good strange or bad strange? I don't know yet. They fell into new rhythms through the summer. The land demanded work, clearing fields, planting late crops, repairing fence lines, rebuilding the trap lines properly. But it was different work than before. Chosen work. Work towards something they owned rather than work to delay inevitable loss. Mara discovered she was good at managing the practical side of things. She kept detailed records of expenses and income, calculated what they needed to survive winter, negotiated with merchants in town for better prices. The skills she'd learned working in her father's store, skills she'd thought were worthless, turned out to be exactly what they needed. Elias focused on the physical work: hunting, trapping, timber. He was better at it now, less desperate and more strategic. The trap lines started producing. They had meat to eat and pelts to trade. Slowly, carefully, they built something that resembled stability. One evening in late July, sitting on the porch they'd added to the cabin, Mara said, "I got a letter from my father." Elias looked up from the trap he was mending. "What did it say?" "That he heard about the trial, that he's glad I'm doing well, that he hopes I understand why he did what he did." She folded the letter carefully. "He wants to visit." "What did you tell him?" "Nothing yet." Mara watched the sun set behind the mountains. "Part of me wants to tell him to go to hell, that he sold me like livestock and doesn't get to pretend we're family now." "And the other part?" "The other part remembers that he was desperate too, trapped in his own way, and that maybe holding on to anger just gives him more power over me than he deserves." Elias set down the trap. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know." "What do you think I should do?" "I think you should do whatever lets you sleep at night. If that's telling him to stay away, fine. If it's forgiving him, also fine. But make the choice for you, not for him." Mara sat with that. The old her would have done what was expected, either welcomed her father with false warmth or rejected him with dramatic anger. But she was different now. She got to choose what kind of person she wanted to be. She wrote back 2 days later. The letter was brief. She acknowledged receiving his message. She said she wasn't ready for a visit, but wasn't ruling it out forever. She told him she was building a good life and hoped he was doing the same. She signed it simply, Mara, not your daughter. It felt honest. That was enough. August brought their first test as actual landowners. A banker from Denver showed up claiming Halridge's estate still had claims on certain properties that had been in dispute before the trial. He was professional, polite, and absolutely convinced he was in the right. Mara listened to his explanation, then pulled out the court documents showing clear title to their land. "This says otherwise. Those documents are under appeal." "By who?" "Halridge's lawyers. The estate has resources even with him in prison." "Then they can take it up with federal prosecutor Wade. Because we're not negotiating." Mara kept her voice level, but firm. "This land is ours. Legally, completely, finally ours. If you want to challenge that, bring court papers. Otherwise, you're trespassing." The banker looked taken aback. He'd clearly expected them to cave, to negotiate, to show the uncertainty that marked people who weren't sure of their standing. Instead, Mara stood there absolutely certain of her ground. "I'll relay your position to my clients," he said stiffly. "You do that." After he left, Elias said, "That was impressive." "That was terrifying. I was shaking the whole time." "Didn't show." "Good." Mara sat down, letting the adrenaline drain. "I'm so tired of fighting." "I know." "When does it end? When do we get to just live without someone trying to take what's ours?" "Maybe never. Maybe fighting for what we have is just part of having it." Elias sat beside her. "But it gets easier, or we get better at it. Same difference." The banker's challenge went nowhere. Wade shut it down within a week, and they heard nothing more. But it reinforced something Mara had been learning. Ownership wasn't a one-time victory. It was a constant assertion, a daily choice to stand your ground. Fall came with hard frosts, and the first serious snow. They were ready this time, cabin tight and warm, food stored properly, wood split and stacked. The contrast to last year was almost absurd. Last year they'd been dying slowly. This year they were preparing to thrive. Remember when we had maybe a week of food left? Elias said one evening, looking at their well-stocked shelves. Remember when you were ready to give up completely? Remember when you showed up and decided that wasn't an option? Mara smiled. Best worst decision I ever made. Coming here? Staying here. They spent the winter working on smaller projects. Elias carved furniture. Mara sewed curtains and quilts, both of them taking time to rest properly for the first time in memory. They read the books Elias's father had left, adventure stories and philosophy and agricultural guides. They talked about expanding in the spring, maybe getting chickens, possibly a cow if they could afford it. It was ordinary. Deeply, beautifully ordinary. And Mara discovered that ordinary was what she'd been fighting for all along. One night in January, almost exactly a year after the trial, they were sitting by the fire when Elias said, "Do you regret it? Any of it?" Mara thought about that honestly. The pain, the fear, the times she'd been convinced they wouldn't survive. No. Really? Really? Because the alternative was staying safe and small and letting other people decide what I deserved. And I'd rather have this hard, uncertain, messy life that I chose than any amount of comfort that came from accepting I was worthless. You were never worthless. I know that now. But I didn't then. And learning it, proving it to myself, that was worth everything it cost. Elias reached for her hand. I'm glad you stayed. I'm glad you let me. They sat there as the fire burned low. Two people who'd been meant to fail, finding their way to something neither of them had imagined possible. Spring brought new challenges. A late frost killed some of their early crops. Elias injured his leg in a fall and couldn't work for 2 weeks. They had unexpected expenses that strained their savings. But they handled it. They adapted. They survived. More than survived, they grew. Elias started teaching tracking and trapping to younger men in the valley, bringing in extra income. Mara took on bookkeeping for 3 other families, using her numerical skills to help people avoid the kind of debt traps Halridge had perfected. They became part of the community in a way neither had expected. One afternoon in May, Marcus showed up with news. Halridge died in prison. Pneumonia. Mara waited to feel something. Satisfaction, relief, vindication. Instead, she just felt tired. How do you feel about it? Like a chapter's closed. Like we can finally stop looking over our shoulders. Marcus handed her a newspaper. Thought you'd want to see the article. It was a long piece about Halridge's crimes, his victims, and the trial that had brought him down. Mara and Elias were mentioned prominently, credited with having the courage to fight back when others had given up. They make us sound heroic, Mara said. You were. We were desperate. There's a difference. Is there? Marcus tilted his head. Because from where I'm standing, choosing to fight when you're desperate, that's the definition of heroic. After he left, Mara and Elias sat on their porch and read the article together. It wasn't entirely accurate. It smoothed over their mistakes, dramatized certain moments, made them sound more certain than they'd ever been. But the core was true. They'd refused to accept injustice, had risked everything to fight it, and had won. Think we'll be remembered? Elias asked. Does it matter? I don't know. Maybe? Mara considered it. I think what matters is that the families who got their land back can build futures now. That the system got a little better because we forced it to. That someone somewhere might hear this story and decide to fight their own battle instead of giving up. She set down the paper. If we're remembered for that, fine. If not, we still did what mattered. Summer came in hot and dry. They worked hard, saved carefully, and slowly built margin into their lives. Not wealth. They'd never be wealthy, but enough. Enough to handle emergencies, enough to plan ahead, enough to breathe. One evening, as they were finishing dinner, Elias said, I've been thinking. About? About making this official. Us, I mean. Mara's heart kicked. We're already married. Legally, yes, but that was a business arrangement. I'm talking about choosing it. Actually marrying each other because we want to, not because we were forced to. You want to marry me again? I want to marry you for real this time. With witnesses, an intention, and an actual choice. He looked nervous, which was endearing. If you want to. Mara felt something warm and certain settle in her chest. Yes, I want to. They married in July on a Sunday afternoon with half the valley in attendance. No church. Neither of them had use for that, but a simple ceremony on their land with Ben Carver officiating and Ruth Carlson crying happily in the front row. Mara wore a simple dress she'd sewn herself. Elias wore his best shirt and looked terrified. When Carver asked if they took each other, Mara said, "I do," and meant it in a way she hadn't been able to mean it the first time. This was choice. This was partnership. This was two people who'd fought their way to something real, deciding to keep fighting together. The celebration lasted until dark. Food and music and dancing and the kind of joy that came from people who knew how easily it could be taken away. Mara danced with Elias, with Carver, with Ruth's sons, with everyone who'd helped them build their life. Happy? Elias asked during a quiet moment. Terrified, Mara admitted. But yes, happy. Why terrified? Because I have something to lose now, and that's scarier than having nothing. We'll figure it out, same as everything else. One day at a time. One day at a time. The years that followed weren't easy. They had hard winters and failed crops and illnesses and all the normal disasters that came with frontier life. But they faced them together, and that made all the difference. Mara learned that strength wasn't about never being afraid or never struggling. It was about choosing to keep going even when you were afraid and struggling. It was about building something day by day, choice by choice, even when the outcome wasn't guaranteed. Elias learned that vulnerability wasn't weakness, that asking for help didn't diminish you, that partnership meant sharing both the burdens and the victories. Together they learned that victory wasn't a moment, it was a process. It wasn't beating one enemy or winning one fight. It was the daily work of building a life worth living, of treating each other with respect, of choosing love even when it would be easier to choose anger or fear or numbness. 5 years after the trial, they stood on their porch watching the sun set over mountains that no longer felt hostile. The land around them was productive, fields yielding crops, livestock healthy, timber operation bringing in steady income. They'd built something that would last. You ever think about how different this could have gone? Elias asked. Every day? What would you change? Mara thought about that honestly. The pain, the fear, the moments when she'd been convinced they wouldn't survive. Nothing. Because changing any of it means we don't end up here. And here is exactly where I want to be. Even with all the hard parts? Especially with the hard parts. Because those are what proved we were strong enough. That we weren't the worthless people everyone assumed we were. Elias put his arm around her. You were never worthless. I know. But I had to prove it to myself. We both did. They stood there as darkness fell. Two people who'd been thrown together by desperation and had built something better than either could have imagined. Their story would be told in the valley for generations, the couple who'd taken down a land baron and won their freedom. But that wasn't the real story. The real story was quieter. It was about two people who'd been written off as failures deciding they were worth more than that. It was about choosing to fight not because victory was guaranteed, but because accepting defeat was unacceptable. It was about learning that strength came from partnership, that courage came from caring about something more than yourself, and that the hardest battles weren't the dramatic ones. They were the daily choice to keep building, keep trying, keep believing that a better life was possible. Mara had arrived in Colorado expecting nothing, carrying nothing but anger and the certainty that the world had no use for someone like her. She'd been traded away like worthless property, sent to marry a stranger everyone assumed was finished. But somewhere in the mud and the cold and the impossible odds, she'd found something no one could take away. Her own strength, her own worth, her own power to choose what happened next. And that, she thought as she leaned against Elias and watched the stars come out over their land, was worth more than any inheritance, any comfort, any life handed to her by someone else's charity. She'd been the reason everything changed, not because she was special or chosen or destined, but because when everyone else saw two worthless people meant to fail, she'd looked at their situation and decided failure wasn't acceptable. That was the lesson, if there was one. That worth wasn't given by others. It was claimed. That power came from refusing to accept other people's limitations. That the biggest victories weren't the ones that looked dramatic from outside. They were the quiet, daily choices to keep standing when everything said to fall. Mara Holloway had been sent to the frontier to fail. Instead, she'd learned to fight. And in fighting, she'd discovered who she really was. Not the burden people had always told her she was, but a woman capable of changing her own story. That was enough. That was everything. And standing on her own land, in the home she'd built with her own hands, beside the partner she'd chosen for herself, Mara finally understood what victory really meant. It meant she got to decide what happened next, and she decided to stay.